From the elegant grace of a Fokker triplane made famous by Baron von Richthofen in World War I, to the powerful piston-driven fighters and bombers of World War II, to the dawn of the jet age, and on to the high-tech marvels of today's supersonic attack aircraft, Warplanes has them all. We'll witness the incredibly swift evolution of military aviation in this fascinating overview of combat aircraft from World War I to the present day. So sit back and relax as we showcase some of the greatest aircraft ever to take the skies. The Fokker DR-1, better known as the Fokker triplane, scored its first victory on August 30th, 1917, and was flown by German pilot Werner Voss. Within 3 weeks, the airplane had shot down an additional 20 Allied aircraft. Although the DR-1 was allocated to many frontline units who used it with success, it is most strongly associated with Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and the squadron he led known as the Flying Circus, so called because of the garish colors of its aircraft. It was the most dreaded German fighter unit of the war. This elegant aircraft is the Focke-Wulf 44 Stieglitz and is owned and maintained by the Confederate Air Force in Harlingen, Texas. It was developed in 1932 as a primary and aerobatic trainer for the German Luftwaffe. On December 7, 1941, the standard Army fighter was the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a tough and versatile aircraft that earned everlasting fame through the exploits of Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers. Before their disbanding in 1942, the Tigers had shot down 286 Japanese planes while losing only 8 P-40s in aerial combat. The P-40 logged a long, distinguished service record and fought in the colors of 28 Allied nations in every operational theater of the war. No fighter, friend or foe, saw wider service. The P-40 was our first-line fighter at the beginning of World War II, but later in the war, the P-51 Mustang made its debut and is one of the most successful stories in aviation. The Royal Air Force designed the P-51 and gave the plans to North American Aviation Corporation with an incredible deadline of only 120 days to produce the first airplane. North American achieved the impossible and delivered the first Mustang in just 117 days. Called the best all-around fighter in World War II, it was faster, more maneuverable, and most important, had a greater cruising range than any other fighter in the U.S. Army Air Force. It was this cruising range, further extended by belly tanks, that gave it a fantastic range in excess of 2,000 miles and an endurance time of over 8 hours. The Mustang's ability to escort was to prove the answer to successful U.S. daylight bombing by B-24s and B-17s. If a single airplane were to be selected to symbolize the spirit of the American people during World War II, it would have to be the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the most celebrated of all the great American planes of the war years. Called the commonest back airplane of the war, the B-17s were known to return to base after being hammered so hard by anti-aircraft fire that 3 engines and sections of wing and tail were destroyed. Without the B-17, said General Carl Spaatz, 1st Air Force Chief of Staff, we might have lost the war. The 8th Air Force first flew its B-17s on European combat missions in August of 1942, but the British RAF had been flying a few since July of the previous year. Throughout the war, the B-17 was the Army's mainstay long-range heavy bomber in Europe and served with distinction everywhere in the vast Pacific theater. From the early days of the war in England, we switched to the early days of the war for the United States. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines and other Pacific islands, the Americans had little to cheer about. What was needed was a psychological victory to boost the morale of the Allied forces and the American people. That victory came in the form of a plan by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and was immortalized in the motion picture 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. The plan was simple: strike the Japanese homeland. Since we had no bases close enough to Japan from which to mount an attack, it was decided to launch a raid from the deck of an aircraft carrier. So, on the 18th of April 1942, 16 U.S. Army B-25 Billy Mitchells took off from the carrier Yorktown, flew the 620 miles to Japan, and actually bombed Tokyo. Little material damage was caused, and all the aircraft were lost after forced landings in China, but the raid's effect on the morale of the American nation was enormous, coming as it did after 4 months of unremitting defeat and disaster. Another source of great pride for the Confederate Air Force is the only B-24 Liberator that remains in flying condition, Diamond Lil. Consolidated's Liberator was manufactured in greater numbers, over 18,000, and probably flew a wider variety of missions from bomber to tanker to transport to photo reconnaissance than any other American plane of the war. In its main role as a strategic bomber, the B-24 shared this mission with the B-17 in Europe and in the Pacific, where its range made it especially effective. In one of its most impressive battle recreations, the CAF recalls one of the most daring and heartbreaking missions of the war. The August 1, 1943 low-level raid on Nazi oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania. The concept of an extremely long-range, high-altitude, large-capacity bomber began to take shape on Boeing's drawing boards as early as 1937. By 1940, the design was complete, and the B-29 Superfortress made its first flight late in 1942. Because of its extremely long range of 3,700 miles, carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs, the Superfort was directed to the Pacific and was not deployed in Europe. From airfields in India and China, the huge bomber flew raids on targets in the China-Burma-India theater. Later, B-29 bases were built on captured Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. From these islands, the 21st Bomber Command staged high-altitude raids on the Japanese homeland. These missions were effective, as were the low-level incendiary raids that followed, but the Japanese War Party insisted on fighting to the bitter end. That bitter end came on August 6th of 1945, and again on August 9th of 1945, when atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On orders from the Emperor, Japan surrendered unconditionally on August 15th, 1945, bringing the hostilities of the most costly war in history to a close. The B-29 you see here is owned and maintained by the Confederate Air Force and is the only one still flying. The F-4U Corsair was respectfully referred to as Whistling Death by the awed Japanese pilots and ground troops who were its unfortunate victims. From its novel design to its exceptional performance, the Corsair has always been a standout. Designed by the Chance Vought Company in 1938, the F-4U was the first fighter with a 2,000 horsepower engine and the first U.S. Navy warplane to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Corsair joined Marine and land-based Navy squadrons in 1943 and fought in every major Pacific battle from that point on. The Corsair's effectiveness and durability were testified by its war record. In aerial combat, F-4Us destroyed 2,140 Japanese aircraft with a loss of only 189 Corsairs, a victory rate of more than 11 to 1. During the Korean War, Corsairs flew 80% of all Navy and Marine close support missions throughout the first year of fighting. One Corsair even downed a MiG-15 jet fighter. The F-4U Corsair continued in production through 1952 and ended its career in 1965, the longest service life of any World War II era fighter. Probably the most effective close support aircraft of the post-war era is the Douglas A-1 Skyraider. It remained in production from the end of World War II until 1957 and was used in the Korean and Vietnam conflicts. The Skyraider has an endurance of up to 10 hours and can be fitted with a wide variety of weapons on 15 attachments. A typical load on a Skyraider would be comprised of a dozen high-velocity 5-inch rockets, 2 1,000-pound bombs, and a napalm canister. A-1s, of which more than 3,000 were built, can be flown with up to 14,000 pounds of underwing stores in addition to their 4 20-millimeter cannons in the wings. Jet aircraft were being developed by both sides during World War II, though the so-called jet age didn't arrive until afterward. One of the earliest jet aircraft was the British de Havilland Vampire. Though its design originated in 1941 and it was developed during the war years, it arrived too late to take part in the hostilities. The prototype first flew on the 20th of September of 1943, but the first production model didn't fly until April of 1945. Intended as an answer to the German Luftwaffe's Me-262, the Vampire did not see combat, entering service with the Royal Air Force in 1946. It has been used by the air forces of about 30 countries and was constructed under license in India, Australia, France, and Italy. The two-seat trainer version, like the T-11 Mark 35, owned and piloted by Jimmy McMillan of Breckenridge, Texas, you see here, was developed by de Havilland in 1950 as a private venture, then converted into an all-weather jet night fighter. The Vampire version remained in first-line series in some countries into the 1960s. Some of the first meetings of jet aircraft from adversarial nations occurred in the skies over Korea between the two airplanes you see flying here, the Soviet MiG-15 and the United States F-86 Sabre. These aircraft are presented courtesy of the Combat Jet Museum based in Houston, Texas. The prototypes of the MiG-15 first flew on December 30th of 1947. It was used from the end of 1948 and first saw combat service in November 1950 in Korea. There it clearly demonstrated its superiority over the contemporary American fighter planes, making the balance of air power shift decisively in favor of Soviet-backed North Korea. Work on the North American F-86 Sabre design began in 1944, and the first prototype flew on October 1st of 1947 and was an immediate success. The Sabres first saw battle in Korea, where they replaced the F-80s and won back air supremacy from the Soviet MiG-15. An aircraft that was developed in the 50s and still sees much active service is the McDonnell F-4 Phantom. The Phantom is still, to this day, considered by many the best fighter bomber ever built, and it has been one of the U.S. aeronautical industry's greatest successes. The project was started by McDonnell in 1953 in response to a request from the U.S. Navy, which called for a twin-jet all-weather assault fighter which had to be supersonic. The first prototype was tested in May of 1958. Over 5,000 of the powerful and versatile Mach 2 aircraft have been produced in dozens of versions. It is still in service over 30 years later with the main air forces of the non-communist world. Another exciting airplane supplied to our air show by the U.S. Air Force is the F-15 Eagle, built by McDonnell Douglas. While this supersonic fighter has not seen any actual combat for the United States, it has been Israel's primary fighter since 1977 and has scored many victories over MiG-21s, 23s, and 25s. Over Lebanon in 1982, it accounted for over 40 victories. Now we're going to turn the show over to Captain Richard McSpadden of the 49th Tactical Fighting Wing from Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, who will describe the flight demo of the F-15 Eagle.
The pilot for today's demonstration is Captain Mitch Fritt, a veteran fighter pilot with more than 1,800 hours fighter time in the F-15. Captain Fritt will execute a high G turn, illustrating the Eagle's exceptional turn rate. Captain Fritt is accelerating to 450 miles per hour. He will perform 3 rapid rolls, demonstrating the F-15's excellent rolling performance. Captain Fritt is now pulling the aircraft up into a climb and decelerating for the next maneuver, a slow-speed pass in the landing configuration. While the F-15 can fly at over twice the speed of sound, it is also fully controllable at slow airspeeds as demonstrated during this maneuver. In 1975, the Eagle established a world record by climbing to over 12 miles in just 2 minutes and 3 seconds. As a testament to the aircraft's exceptional power, This record, along with 5 others, remains unbroken. The world-famous, record-setting Eagle Climb.
Next up is a fantastic example of a modern military flight display as we admire the menacing appearance of the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a frontline ground attack aircraft of the United States Air Force. You may have noticed this is not the most beautiful airplane flying in the skies today. In fact, it's downright ugly. It's affectionately referred to as the Warthog, and in spite of its gruesome appearance, it flies its highly specialized support missions better than anything else in the air. The Warthog is often referred to as a tank killer, and low-level support of ground troops is its forte. Let's watch as this pair of A-10 Thunderbolt IIs go through their paces in this simulated ground assault. Working with the A-10s are a detachment of United States Marines. These soldiers are from the 1st Battalion of the 23rd Marines, and we really have to hand it to these guys. As you can see, we've recently had some rain, and that ground is more than just a wee bit wet. They're showing us how the ground forces would advance on a position with the help of the Thunderbolt IIs. The dense smoke covers their advance. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is the U.S. Air Force current frontline fighter. It is considered by many experts to be the most agile combat aircraft in the skies today. The F-16 first flew in 1974, and the first U.S. Air Force squadron of them was activated in 1979. The air forces of several NATO countries began flying them shortly thereafter. In 1981, Israel began flying the Falcon and used them to destroy the Iraqi nuclear plant near Ozark. Designed as a multi-purpose airplane, it has certainly lived up to expectations. Fast and agile, yet capable of carrying heavy loads, the F-16, capable of Mach 2, serves as an interceptor or a fighter bomber. One of the Falcon's most interesting features is the fly-by-wire nature of its controlled surfaces. This means that the hydraulic work once done by rods and cables is done in the F-16 by a computerized network of electric motors, making the airplane much more responsive and earning it the nickname, the electric jet. One of the most ambitious undertakings of the British aeronautical industry was the development of the Hawker Siddeley Harrier, the first vertical takeoff and landing combat aircraft ever put into production. The Harrier is a revolutionary aircraft which was originally designed as a land-based airplane, but has also proven extremely useful as a carrier-borne plane. The development program was long and laborious. It started in 1957 with the development of a new version of the Orpheus turbofan engine, in which the exhaust airflow could be vectored rearward, downward, or at an intermediate angle to give jet lift to the aircraft. In 1969, the Harrier program finally came into its own when the United States showed an interest in the airplane and ordered a dozen for the United States Marine Corps. Since that time, the AV-8 Harrier has become an integral part of Marine close support strategy. The Rockwell B-1 has been called the most expensive aircraft ever built. It was designed at the end of the 1960s to replace the B-52 in the role of low-altitude strategic bomber. The prototype first flew on December 23, 1974. The long and difficult development phase was brought to a halt in June of 1977 by President Carter. Priority was then given to the development of the newest generation of intercontinental missiles. America's hopes of putting the B-1 into production were not completely set aside, and the project was revived under President Reagan. The B-1 is now in active service with the United States Air Force. The U.S. Navy's newest carrier-based fighter is the sleek McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornet. The Hornet is to the Navy what the F-16 is to the Air Force, an agile, relatively low-cost, single-seat jet that can perform a variety of jobs from fighter to attack aircraft. The biggest difference is that the FA-18 is a two-engine airplane. This is now a requirement of the Navy for its carrier-based aircraft due to the safety factor provided by a second engine. The FA-18 was first flown in November of 1978 and made its first carrier flights the following October from the deck of the USS America. Australia and Canada also selected the Hornet for many of the same reasons that the United States Navy picked it. Cost and versatility were factors, as was the fact of its having two engines. The Canadian Air Force also uses an aerial refueling system identical to the one used by the U.S. Navy. When projecting the role of the Hornet, the Marine Corps tradition of being America's first to fight should be considered. If the United States enters a conflict and has to send in the Marines, the FA-18 will be there backing them up. This is Ray Norton, and I want to extend our sincere appreciation to the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, the Confederate Air Force, the Combat Jet Museum, and all the aviation enthusiasts who perpetuate our aeronautical heritage. I also want to thank you for being with us, and I hope you'll join us again soon for another adventure into the wonderful world of flying.